Foreign policy for Jimmy Carter was a lot like what it was for Richard Nixon. And what I mean by that is it was the arena in which Carter enjoyed some success, and it was also one of the major factors which prevented Jimmy Carter from making any more headway than he did domestically. And there is some overlap here that you'll see clearly, I think, in just a moment. But I mentioned to you that Jimmy Carter had run as the outsider, the person who would clean up Washington in a sense. And that very notion of cleaning up suggests certain moral standards. Following in the wake of the Helsinki Accords, Carter makes it a central plank of his larger foreign policy goals that morality, ethics, human rights be a fundamental part of what he would seek. For very practical reasons and arguably for sort of high ideals, Carter will, among other things, complete a process of relieving the United States of the Panama Canal. Since its construction, the United States had overseen the canal, but beginning in the early 1970s, it was clear that the United States was not able to necessarily dominate the world, that the third world could affect the United States at home, and that Cold War relations, thanks to detente, were changing. Carter capped off a series of negotiations. He ended them. A series of negotiations to turn the canal over to Panama. That was viewed differently by different people. On the one hand, it suggested a new relationship with Latin America, perhaps, that we trust Panama. But by others, it was seen as a sign of weakness, that the United States was surrendering its control, its claim to control, and its presence in the world. The Panama Canal, remember, is central to the movement of the United States Navy and to commerce. Carter sought to strengthen ties to China, but human rights continually arose as an issue, as it continues to do. And in June of 1979, he signed the SALT II agreements with the Soviets. The problem Carter had, of course, was domestic. He couldn't get it through the Senate. He couldn't get it approved by the Senate. And then, before he could, the Soviet Union invaded the country of Afghanistan. We'll talk more about that a little bit later lecture. But the Soviets invade Afghanistan primarily to prop up a pro-Soviet government. Carter responded, again, with that moralistic tone. Carter responded by putting in place an embargo, denying wheat to the Soviet Union. Remember, farmers had been producing vast quantities. There had been famine around the world. Soviet economics, simply central planning, was not providing enough wheat for the Soviet people. Carter begins to actually curtails the flow of American wheat to the Soviets, and this was, as I recall, a big thing at the time. In 1980, prevents the U.S. Olympic team from attending the Summer Olympics, which were in Moscow. Where he had more success in foreign policy was with the Camp David Accords. In September of 1978, Carter would invite the leader of Egypt, Anwar el-Sadat, and the leader of Israel, Menachem Begin, to Camp David, which is a presidential retreat in Maryland, to sit down and to work out an agreement that would end the conflict, end the fighting that had existed going all the way back to 1948, but had been particularly prominent in the 6 Days War, you may recall from earlier, and the Yom Kippur War. March 26, 1979, Carter could announce the signing of the Camp David Accords, as they came to be known, which included, among other things, peace between Israel and Egypt, the conclusion of that state of war which had existed, but also a schedule for the creation of a Palestinian homeland. It's rather amazing in a way that Jimmy Carter, this Georgia peanut farmer, should come away with what was a major, major diplomatic coup, which promised at the time to bring peace to the Middle East. At least it seemed to, perhaps, but didn't. And that became rather apparent rather quickly. Other Arab states, or Arab states across the Middle East, rejected the Camp David Accords, refused to sign on. And in 1981, Anwar Sadat was assassinated in Egypt. Making peace often proved costly. For the United States, that cost came in part in places like Beirut, Lebanon, and in Tehran, Iran. You may recall from previous lectures when we talked about the Cold War and how the Eisenhower administration pursued the use of covert operations through the CIA and other means to encourage the overthrow of governments and policies that were kind to the United States. And you'll notice, too, how important oil has become here. We've talked about the oil embargo, and I should mention that by 1979, there was a subsequent embargo of oil. Oil prices and thus inflation in the U.S. jumped tremendously in 1979. But in 1953, dropping back just a bit, remember that the United States had basically overthrown the existing government of Iran and put in control of Iran the Shah, largely to protect American oil interests and to deny Iran to the Soviet Union. It's worth mentioning, too, that in part because of the issues with Israel in the Middle East, there was a growing fundamentalist sentiment in the Middle East. A return to roots, if you will, increasingly a kind of turning to those aspects of Islam which promised liberation, which promised a method of dealing with the situation in which so many people in the Middle East, and people like the Palestinians, found themselves by the 1970s. Well, in January of 1979, there's an overthrow of the Shah of Iran. It is led by a cleric, a Muslim cleric, the Ayatollah Khomeini. And the Shah is forced to flee. In November of 1979, after a request from the Shah of Iran for cancer treatment in the United States, he is allowed access. This allowance infuriates the sort of revolutionaries in Iran, led in no small part, notice the countercultural connection here, it's students. Oftentimes it's students who are most engaged in this revolution that's taking place not only in the United States in the 60s, but Iran in the 70s. And students organized, really by other forces, it's true, but nonetheless, it's students that will take over the United States Embassy in Tehran. The people inside the embassy are held hostage. And it is an amazing period, and I remember it reasonably well. An amazing period lasting some 444 days, in which every night of the nightly news, and it was nightly back then, we all kind of watched the news, you only had 3 options. There was a counting taking place. Each day before it was over was counted off, and it must have been like water torture to the president, to Jimmy Carter. Because it turned out that there was nothing Carter could do or would do. And the situation just continued and continued and continued and continued. And this kind of drumbeat, this rhythmic pounding, reinforced that sense of the powerlessness of this great nation, the United States, to basically act its will, to enforce its will upon Iran. And really the rest of the world. And Carter let it go. And when he did try in April of 1980 to rescue the hostages, the rescue effort itself failed in a horrible mass of wreckage and carnage in the sands of Iran. 8 U.S. service people died in the attempt. It went wrong. And the United States appeared, at least, in the face of this upstart nation upon whose oil we seem to be dependent like a drug. The United States seemed to be impotent. It sums up the 70s in a way, for me. The expansion of this quest for freedom continues. It expands outward to incorporate and include new groups, but there's a dark side to it. President who promises law and order but is involved in most likely criminal activities, cover-ups, and the inability of Gerald Ford or Jimmy Carter to turn things around. Meanwhile, those blue-collar workers across the United States are losing their jobs, and farmers are losing their farms. You can understand, I think, why across the U.S. some people had begun to doubt what the future held for the Republic.